Welcome to my talk about the interactive visual analysis of regional time series correlation in multi-field climate ensembles. I'm Marina and this is joint work with Böttinger and Lars Linsen. Let's have a look into the role of simulations in climate science. In climate science, it's very common to run spatio-temporal simulations to predict the evolution over time. To also capture the uncertainty, several simulation runs for different initial conditions are computed. Then, the climate variation does not only depend on the temperature, but also on other variables, for example, the pressure and the precipitation. Therefore, we obtain a large amount of data, which is called a multi-field climate ensemble. Now, one could ask, how are the different regions in the different fields related? For example, how is the precipitation in Africa related to the temperature in Europe? To answer these questions, we use correlations, which are a common measure to study the relations between time series. For analyzing the correlations, we propose an analytical workflow which consists of two steps. We start with the preprocessing step, followed by an interactive visual analysis. In the preprocessing, we use the ensemble to compute a spatial segmentation to reduce the amount of data, followed by computing correlation matrices which store the relations between the different regions. Then, based on the correlation matrices, we can perform an interactive visual analysis starting from overview visualizations and including more detailed visualizations. Before looking into the visual analysis, let's have a more detailed look into the preprocessing. For computing correlation matrices, we need to define how correlations can be computed to cover the whole variation over the ensemble. We use the same approach as already presented at Euroviz 2 years ago, where we look at the data not at spatial fields varying over time, but instead at the individual samples. For each sample, we have one set of time series, where each time series corresponds to one ensemble member. Now, we can concatenate the individual time series and obtain one concatenated time series for each spatial sample. From the concatenated time series, we can compute a correlation matrix using any correlation measure. In this work, we use the Pearson correlation coefficient. Now that we know how to use correlation measures for ensembles, we can look into the preprocessing in a little bit more detail. So first, we start with the ensemble and compute the segmentation. The computation of the segmentation is important to reduce the amount of data for the analysis. Thus, we do not work on the original spatial resolution, which might be very high, but instead on the level of segments. In the segmentation, we assume that each segment is roughly homogeneous, such that we can compute meaningful means. In this work, we computed the segmentation based on the approach we presented in the paper 2 years ago. But for the rest of the talk, it's not important how we obtained the segmentation. It's only important that we have a segmentation and that we can assume the segments to be homogeneous, because this allows for computing the segment means. In the following, we will only work with the means and not on the original spatial resolution, which is the only way to make the following analysis computationally feasible. Note that these steps are all computed for each field separately, so we have one segmentation for each field. And for each segment of each field, we have one segment mean. Then, we combine all fields for computing the correlation matrices, because we want to perform a multi-field analysis. Thus, we obtain one aggregated correlation matrix where each entry corresponds to one segment of one of the fields, and overall, it covers all segments of all fields. This aggregated correlation matrix was computed by using the correlation measure, as I described in the slide before, but we also want to study the correlations variation over the ensemble. Therefore, we compute one correlation matrix for each individual member. This leads, for example, in case of 100 ensemble members, to 100 member-wise correlation matrices and one aggregated correlation matrix, which covers the whole ensemble. Now that we looked into the preprocessing and how we obtain our correlation matrices, let's have a more detailed look into our interactive visual analysis. Our analysis combines overview visualizations with 3 more detailed visualizations. Each visualization follows a specific goal, which I will describe in the following in more detail. So let's start with the embedding. Here, we want to find clusters of correlated or anti-correlated segments. For analyzing the correlations, we don't want to select one specific reference point, but instead we want to find groups of related segments. Therefore, we at first map the correlations to distances, where the users can choose if anti-correlations should be encoded as small or as large distances. As we want to find clusters, we choose a UMAP embedding, as UMAP proved to be very good in preserving clusters. The UMAP embedding might look like this, where each point represents one segment of one field. The field to which the corresponding segment belongs to is encoded by color. However, if we look into this embedding, we see that we lose any spatial information. As we also want to provide spatial context, we include the spatial view, where we use a map view that is closely linked to the embedding. If the user selects a group of points in the embedding, the outlines of the corresponding segments are shown in the map view, as you can see here. We choose to only show the outlines, as this allows for drawing the segments of different fields on top of each other. To be consistent with the embedding, we choose the same color coding according to the fields. However, the linking also works the other way around. Thus, the users can also select regions in the map, and the corresponding points in the embedding are highlighted. Next, we want to look into a little bit more detail. Projections like UMAP might also contain projection artifacts. Therefore, we want to visualize the correlations between the segments explicitly, and we also want to include the variation over the ensemble to not miss any important features by only looking into aggregated data. Therefore, we propose to use a heat map visualization where we use colors to encode the aggregated correlation values. These are the same values as used for computing the embedding, and this allows us to find artifacts for the projection, but also to read off the correlation values more explicitly. We decided against using text labels for the heat map because the segment IDs are not very meaningful. Instead, we use a color coding, where the different colors are showing the different fields that the segments belong to. Finally, to capture the uncertainty over the ensemble, we show a distribution of the member-wise correlation overlaid as a graph. The x direction represents the correlation, and we use a kernel density estimate to compute the distribution. If it's a broad distribution, we have a wide spread over the ensemble. And if it's a more narrow distribution like here, the ensemble members agree well to each other. After having analyzed the correlations on different levels of detail, we also want to visualize the temporal evolution of the selected segments directly to study how the simulation outcome evolves over time. We include the time series visualization, where we show all fields together and color code them according to the fields they belong to. To be able to read off the individual values of the different fields, we include one axis per field. To capture the uncertainty over the ensemble, use the functional median, which is the median as it is used in functional box plots. Thus, we show one representative, most central ensemble member. We also cover the spread over the ensemble by showing it as a band around the median. Here we already see some temporal variation that might be periodic. Especially in climate science, many features occur periodically. Therefore, we also want to analyze the frequency spectrum of the time series and include the possibility for Fourier analysis. We start by computing a Fourier transform for each ensemble member individually, and then we visualize it in a modified line chart. Here we show the ensemble mean. We decide to use the mean instead of a median to reduce noise. We also cover the spread over the ensemble by again using bands around the mean. Now that I introduced the different visualizations that we included in our approach, let's have a look into an application example. In our paper, we looked into the Max Planck Institute Grand Ensemble dataset, which is an ensemble consisting of 100 members and 1,128 time steps, ranging from 2006 to 2099. In total, we have 4 simulated fields and 5 derived fields, which are mainly anomalies. For example, here you see the temperature variation of one single ensemble member over time. We want to look into the El Niño phenomenon, which probably many of you have heard of, especially as it was very prominent in the news recently. We start with a look at the embedding, where small distances are either correlated or anti-correlated data, as we want to study both. We see that we have some structures, like on the right we have more of the temperature segments, and the relative precipitation anomaly is basically spread all over the embedding. However, if we want to study the El Niño phenomenon, we select one region of interest in the map view, as we can see here. We see that the segments corresponding to the temperature of the selected regions are located in the center of the embedding. As the El Niño phenomenon is mainly characterized by the temperature anomaly in this region, we next select the samples around this region. Then we obtain the following segments that we see in the map view on the top right. Here we see that we have many temperature segments in the region that is very typical for the El Niño phenomenon, but also some in the north of South America and a segment in eastern Australia. But you also see precipitation segments in the west of southern Africa. Thus, we can see that our tool enables us to select clusters of multiple fields at once. If we now look into the correlation matrix to study the correlations in more detail, we can see that all the temperature-related segments, which are color-coded in pink, are correlated to each other, while the green segments, which belong to the relative precipitation anomaly, show an anti-correlation to all the temperature segments. Therefore, we can observe that the El Niño phenomenon is anti-correlated to the relative precipitation anomaly in the west of southern Africa, as well as correlated to the temperature in eastern Australia. Both are findings that are also present in the current IPCC report and, therefore, confirm knowledge about the climate anomaly. The El Niño phenomenon is a periodic phenomenon that occurs every few years. That is why we also want to look into the Fourier spectrum of this anomaly. We start by limiting the time for the computation to 2006 to 2035 and obtain a spectrum like this. There's a very prominent peak at very low frequencies, and we are not entirely sure where it originated from. What is of more interest in the context of the El Niño phenomenon is this peak that we see here for a periodicity of 3.2 years. If we now shift our time window, we see that this peak shifts over to a periodicity of 2.6 years, which indicates a shortening of the El Niño period. Additionally, for this time span of 2070 to 2100, we also see a prominent peak for a frequency of 1 per year. As we are looking into anomalies, this indicates that the seasonal fluctuations strongly increased, which is linked to global warming. The shift in the El Niño phenomenon has also been attributed to climate change. In our paper, we present additional use cases. But now I want to conclude my talk, in which I presented an approach for the correlation analysis of multi-field climate ensembles. We use a visual analysis approach on different levels of detail. One strength of our approach is that we do not need to choose a reference point, but can analyze the full ensemble at once. Our approach basically works for 3D data as it is, only the spatial visualizations needs to be adapted, for example by using a common volume visualization. I already briefly mentioned that we see some phenomena in the Fourier spectra that needs further investigation. So, for future work, we want to look more deeply into the visualization of Fourier spectra for ensemble data. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. If you want to try our approach, our code is available on GitHub.